All right. So today it's time to talk about Afghanistan. This is the big issue just consuming the media right now. And there's a lot to say about it on the US side, about what the US did, about this whole war, about where it was heading. God, just about almost every single thing. I mean, briefly, we'll get into China. I mean, we're going to talk about how this yet another sign of China about to take over the world. America's decline. Look, America's lost in Iraq. America lost in Afghanistan. Had to have this hasty Saigon-esque retreat out of the country. People falling off planes. Terrible look. Terrible situation in general. And does that leave the door open for China? So that's questions I was asked recently on when I was interviewed on a podcast, and getting this sort of sense from a lot of people and the basic media hysteria around this issue, around Afghanistan, around the retreat, around how it impacts election optics, and all of that is clearly consuming everything right now. So I'm going to talk about the China angle for it. But first, I'm going to just briefly riff on this whole thing that's going on with Afghanistan and just how it's being portrayed. So this whole thing, Afghanistan from the beginning was a disaster. The United States did not manage to actually defeat Al Qaeda. They ran into the mountains, basically. And then afterwards, we decided to change up the plan and let's try and turn, instead of just defeating the terrorist group, let's try and turn Afghanistan into a place free from terrorism, free from Islamic extremism, radical Islam, whatever you want to call it, whichever side of the political spectrum your language fits. That's what the U.S. decided to do, and basically that was starting in 2002. And people knew in 2002 that this would not work. This was not ever going to work, and it didn't take much. I mean, at that time, people were already talking about, hey, let's go look at how the British Empire did, or even more recently, the Soviet Union, or basically anyone. I mean, the Ottomans, the Mongols, everyone. It just goes on and on about how bad this place is, and it has nothing to do with the people or this or that. It is just about how this piece of land on earth, Afghanistan, is among the worst places to attempt any sort of large-scale human development. And anything we associate with economic development, modern freedoms, religious tolerance, any form of pluralism, all of this, you were never going to get it there. So this entire time, the United States was sort of living in a dream, in a fantasy. I mean, even the people that we were allied with, these weren't good guys. The people in the Northern Alliance, they weren't good guys. This was a very much like, all right, let's pick some bad dudes who maybe are drug smugglers and child kidnappers and worse, and let's try and throw them at the other bad dudes that we don't like. And the entire government had never really functioned. I mean, this has been decades, and we don't need to get into all this. But the big thing here is that more time wouldn't have mattered, and some president eventually had to just pull the trigger, and it looks like it was Biden. I mean, for whatever it's worth, or it is what it is. I mean, he's kind of the guy left holding the bag, and everyone can go speculate about what this means for election politics, which is actually probably what most people care about. Really, the sense I'm getting is that people actually don't care about Afghanistan because the United States hasn't really cared about Afghanistan, honestly, for like 12 years at least, and that didn't change with this whole situation. I mean, all the terrible stuff with the translators, I mean, all this is really awful, but that isn't where the actual energy in the United States is. It's really focused on Biden, how this might impact the 2022 midterm elections, and then 2024, obviously, and all of that. And that's fine. That's kind of how the U.S. is. We are focused on ourselves more than ever. This retreat from the rest of the world is just going to make all of this domestic politics that we're all consumed by even more insistent and overwhelming and in everybody's face all the time. The main issue for the next couple of years at least probably is going to be China. That's the one big thing around the world that you can't really ignore, you can't really flee from, because China just seems like such an immense, large, powerful, persistent sort of threat. And it's funny because I was interested in China around when the United States actually was invading Afghanistan. I was already at that time thinking, wow, what a weird place to be in when, perhaps there's a larger, more impactful country that we should learn about, think about, and maybe focus on. But it got derailed. Even the Bush administration was actually looking at trying to confront China more, but that didn't happen because of this whole battle against Islamic extremism. So history sort of shifted with that, and we ended up in these wars. But the real question now, as the U.S. retreats, is, well, what does this mean for... It's always the same question. It's like, all right, U.S. credibility is under threat. This is the whole Vietnam thing. This is this whole perspective the United States has about how it gets into wars after World War II has been so distorted and so messed up and so much about perception and this weird and managing an alliance system and all this that we've lost any concept of what any of this is about. And for better or worse, China is actually going to be the thing that actually tries to focus us on what matters and what is real and what isn't, because trying to talk about who is your ally when you're in Afghanistan and who is an ally in general, these are not simple questions anymore, and they don't make the sort of easy sense that unfortunately we wish they did. So that's something for another episode, another conversation, really. But today we're going to talk about Afghanistan. So I've been getting this question, okay, is China just going to take it over? And God, by all means, let them. If there's anything that the United States has learned after 20 years, it is that Afghanistan, you don't really get much from occupying Afghanistan. This was not a place the United States went to gain economic riches in any way. No one thinks that. And so now I get all these questions like, oh, well, maybe China's going to come in and take all the natural resources they have and all this and all that. And it's like, guys, there is nothing in Afghanistan, basically, that is worth the effort of dealing with Afghanistan. You need infrastructure to take out any minerals or resources that are there. The people talked about all the gold, all sorts of minerals 15 years ago that exist in Afghanistan. But the process of getting it out of the mountains, of building distribution systems, of building the functional labor market and workforce to do it, to deal with all of the incessant, endless bribery and just basic systems that you'd expect in any sort of country don't exist there. And best of luck trying to, just trying to integrate Afghanistan into a modern supply chain. It is so crazy. Just the idea of that. China has a whole, at this point, basically a propaganda blitz about integrating Central Asia and all that, but it is pretty heavily avoiding Afghanistan for a lot of really smart reasons, and there's just so little. The only benefit of Afghanistan for China right now is really the optics. It looks so good. It's thumbing its nose at the United States. Hey, you guys left. We're actually, Afghanistan, obviously, for people who know, China actually borders Afghanistan. So we've been occupying a country for like 20 years that bordered China, which we should think about when considering why China does things it does and thinks the United States is the way it is when it just invades. Well, it's also invaded Korea, and we also invaded Vietnam, and we kind of do stuff like this all the time. But that being said, that being left aside, the real question of just what are you going to do with Afghanistan? There's nothing to do there. The only thing you do right now for limited propaganda benefit is to just say, wow, the United States, so incompetent, so pathetic, so idiotic. It never realized what happened. It never just gave up. And here it is with this ignominious defeat and retreat. And China's just going to play that up. It's kind of playing it up for the same reason that the American media is playing it up so heavily. We all knew something like this was going to happen. This is Vietnam. This is how it was going to happen. We weren't getting a Korea out of this war. We were not going to end up with a modern, insanely sophisticated country out of Afghanistan. And what China wants to do is basically take these benefits, kind of thumb its nose at the United States, like I was saying, and then also, push this broader narrative that the United States is in retreat, decline, etc., and that China is going to be taking up the space that it retreats from. The problem, of course, is that China is not going to be taking up any of these places, and the best place to actually see this is, of course, Afghanistan, because no one's going into Afghanistan. By all means, China should try, but the real lesson for China from the United States, from the Soviet Union, from the British Empire, from everyone going into Afghanistan, would be to not go into Afghanistan. That would be a sign that China had actually learned the lesson that all these other countries just missed. The U.S. knew. People knew. The government, people, educated people in consulting firms, in contracting groups, in the actual administration, in political advocacy groups, everyone quickly learned about the history of Afghanistan and how stupid it was to be there. But the United States acted emotionally. This was not a strategic war. It never was. It was an emotional response. The U.S. just freaked out and then invaded a country. Maybe this is something that people in the political science world need to absorb more in sort of the political commentary world, that there's deep emotional reactions to events, and countries respond in these bizarre manners that don't ever fit our ideal of whatever sort of strategic model you have for human behavior or state behavior. It never really works like that. It does sometimes, but really when it counts, when the crisis hits, it usually does not. And people should think about that when they're thinking about China and all sorts of things it has with its neighbors all around the country, particularly Taiwan and Japan. But in general, the United States did the exact same thing. And we have been basically trying to invent a rationale afterwards for what we were doing in that country. And the basic rationale was, oh no, we're here, we can't leave, we look lame. That's basically what it was. The United States does not take L's. It does not lose easily. We basically sat there for 20 years ineffectually to not be visibly taking an L. And it's terrible. I mean, this is a similar thing that happened in Vietnam in many ways. There's perception management stuff, dealing with France, and even things in the Iraq War. They're very similar because the United States doesn't know how to make war. It doesn't really have the sort of enemies that you use for the military it has. So there's all sorts of problems that crop up endlessly. And it's sad because the U.S. military is extremely competent, but the political accountability for military actions and behavior all around the world just doesn't exist. So who gets blamed for Afghanistan? Well, the guy holding the bag. So it'd be Obama. I mean, it'd be Biden. But what about all the people who got us in there in the first place? They're gone. They've rode out into the sunset, and you don't get change. So you don't even get, in the United States, you're never going to get a process where the general educated population, informed group of the people concerned about this stuff, basically, there's never going to be some sort of understanding about what went wrong and what can be done again. It's the discourse, the ability to do that, to have that conversation, does not exist. It's going to be roped up into these broader global propaganda battles with China and things with the European Union as well, and then with just the local American domestic politics, which is even more important than the stuff with China and all that. This local politics is so consuming that, and it's also these local politics, these repeated election cycles and all that prevents in many ways the accountability for long wars. Like there's no one in the government who can be accountable for 20 years of activity. There's meant to be churn. There's meant to be turnover. There's meant to be an evolution in the government, an evolution in the workforce that works there, and all that. The problem with that, though, is when you have just terrible decisions that the United States cannot back away from. And we should all be thinking about why the United States just can't back off from all of its bad decisions. And I don't actually have much confidence in anything getting done on that sort of train of inquiry. That's just, nothing's going to happen there. Everything that's going on is actually leading in a very different direction, which is really unfortunate. But let's get back to China really quick. So the United States gets into these wars, basically creates conditions that it can never win, creates requirements for victory that are impossible to meet, and then slowly, lurchingly, eventually, begrudgingly admits defeat after decades. The question of what something like this would look like for China is actually a really good thing to bring up, because if the U.S. is retreating from the world and China's just going to move on in, well, there's pretty interesting things about how the Chinese would go to war as well. So there's obviously Sun Tzu, all this stuff, who's so, I don't want to say he's overrated, but he's so overhyped for things that, we'll leave that aside. But basically, there's a long military tradition in China, and it has nothing to do with what the Communist Party says is Chinese history or peace or anything. There's a very violent place, constant war, constant frontier battles all the time. It is just as difficult for the Chinese leadership, any Chinese government, to lose wars as it is for the United States. In fact, it's so difficult that modern China is too afraid, has been historically too afraid to go to war. That's one way to put it, because since 1979, China has not done any military action since 1979 in any real sense. They have all of the accoutrements of like a modern war, securing airspace, securing your communications, moving all this stuff, all the modern maneuver warfare, all of this stuff, every single little piece of it, China's never done in any real form. So there's good things to think about how certain types of war, information war, sort of battles in the electromagnetic spectrum, how all this will play out, and if there's a sense in which China is maybe it missed certain elements of modern war, but it's going to move on to later stages, to the current stage, and be able to do well. Like, that's a whole other thing. But losing at all for the Chinese Communist Party is a very frightening prospect, because you can't recover. The same thing that lets the United States never end a war because basically politicians are already gone. The ones who made the decisions are already gone, and the credibility of none of them is really on the line. It's very different. In China, the credibility of the Communist Party itself is always on the line. So you can't lose a war. You really can't. Well, you can try. I mean, you can totally constrain the entire like media space. You can make it out to be whatever it is. Like the way the United States could never say, "Hey, we're actually winning in Afghanistan." I mean, you had little blitzes in Iraq and Afghanistan when both of the Obama and Bush administrations were trying to like prevent a failure, basically a gruesome public global failure, and they just kind of had a blitz about, oh, this is going to fix it. This is going to fix it. Again, it worked briefly during their campaign cycles, and then quickly it was just you couldn't maintain the narrative that the United States was winning. In China, conceivably you can. Well, see, I mean, you're trending. China's already trending in this direction, but you start doing stuff like that, you're going to very much detach from reality, and the blowback, the whiplash when it hits, like the United States is getting right now. We're getting whiplash from when this entire this forever war far away that doesn't really matter. It just goes on, blah blah blah, and then finally it ends. After all that time, it snaps back, and the population has to sort of process this event. You really don't want something like that happening in China, where you have decades of deception around something like this, and then boom, it snaps back. That wouldn't be good. Most likely, China can't even get into that place. It wouldn't last years. There's no war around China that would probably last years with the government even surviving. So that is an interesting parallel, really, between the United States and China. There's weird symmetries between the United States and China in these things. I wouldn't say symmetry. Maybe they're not. They're definitely not parallels. I mean, there's basically areas where the problems in each system seem to reflect each other for whatever reason in very odd ways. But the mirror image of the United States' failure to ever get out of Afghanistan is a good reason for why China doesn't get into most wars in the first place. The real place you'd have to watch in general is just the East China Sea, particularly Taiwan and Japan. There's deep animus, there's propaganda benefits, there's stuff like that could really push it. But pushing the Chinese military, which is a very corrupt organization, to actually fight wars for a long period of time, it's very different. I mean, we take for granted the fact that the United States has a sort of civilian military that hasn't existed really in most anywhere at this scale ever. So it's actually a very big accomplishment. And to have a competent one at the same time is really impressive. It's very different in China, where the PLA is much, its role in China is very different than the military in the United States. And that also complicates all of these questions about military operations. Again, it actually leans towards conservatism on the Chinese side because the threat for the entire system is greater. Whereas the United States has this massive military that doesn't really have a threat. And then the second it gets emotionally triggered, great word for this, it just reacts violently and unpredictably, and then tries to justify what happened afterwards. So this is the real value of Afghanistan. Thinking about this, if we're going to hear for a long time about how Afghanistan was this giant disaster, this retreat is pretty terrible, and it happened so quickly. I mean, but again, 2 weeks, this is awful. I mean, it shows how little any of this mattered, that what the United States had built was really just basically the United States military was the wall that prevented the Taliban from just rushing right in. But at the same time, 2 more months, if it had taken 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, this is mostly just optics. This was inevitable anyway. The real question, as the pundits keep talking about how whether the United States is failing and declining and what's it a sign of and what does this mean, blah, 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 we need to have the broader perspective that this is the end of an era already anyway. The development era, the era from 1945 to 2020, this whole period where any country at all was going all around the world to do all sorts of things, this is not going to be the norm. This is over. Even the idea of developing a country like Afghanistan is a farce for the next 20, I mean, it was a farce to begin with. Just the idea in the next 20 or 15 or 20 years is just insane. It's not going to happen. The number of places that are going to be able to develop at all is so much more limited that even talking about a place like Afghanistan means we don't quite get the world we're in. And that's really dangerous. And it's unfortunate because we only have the model of the last 75 years. Now we're trying to think beyond it, and no one knows how to talk about what's going on. So you hear people say, oh, our allies and blah, 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 blah in Europe. It's like, what did our European allies matter at all for Afghanistan? It didn't matter either way, whether they've been there or not, or the sense of solidarity or not. None of this is what we think it is anymore. And it's really unfortunate because we're going to be sleepwalking through all these dead frames of analysis for looks like many years as we just get consumed by our own nonsense. And then the actual perspective on the rest of the world is going to be seriously out of date by the time we even start paying attention again. So, well, that got a little abstract for people probably. But yeah, I'd say the big takeaway is don't worry about China rushing into Afghanistan. And if they do rush into Afghanistan, by all means, let them rush into Afghanistan. There is so little there that is worth the time of the Chinese government that has anything to do with the real world and not propaganda. There's just, yeah, it would be, the real lesson would be if China could avoid it. But you never know. The propaganda benefits are actually so big right now. It's so crucial that maybe you just kind of cruise in for a little bit. But we'll see. Maybe countries just don't actually learn these big lessons, and they are just emotional in all sorts of ways. Like maybe China just has so much glee that the United States has failed so publicly and obviously that it just can't help itself but try and push in certain ways. Will this lead to anything impressive for China or for Afghanistan or for the rest of the world? No. In the end, this whole war in Afghanistan and Iraq, there is something very important to it finally coming to an end, because we do need to think about the world that we're entering and all of these hangers-on from before, not even just before COVID, but just before what's coming, is they don't help us. They're just going to make it even harder to get a sense of what's going on. So we'll leave it at that.